Good evening. I'm going to go ahead and get us started, if that's okay. My name is Dr. Robin Bates, and I'm happy to welcome you here this evening. Established in 1992, the Turner Endowment and Distinguished Chair in the Humanities position honors the contributions of John M. Turner, Jr., class of 1929, to his alma mater. Dr. Turner served at University of Lynchburg 41 years as a professor of English, dean of the college, and vice president for academic affairs from 1933 to 1974. The funding for the chair was provided by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and matched 3-1 by alumni, faculty, staff, and friends of the college. Income from this fund supports an endowed professorship in the humanities. It is my great privilege to serve a term as the Turner Chair, one of the primary functions of which is to bring great speakers in the humanities to our campus. I'm going to confess that I did not decide to invite Dr. Kemp to be the spring 2024 Turner Lecturer while reading their brilliant work, although I very much enjoy reading their brilliant work, but rather while scrolling through my Instagram stories and stumbling on their live, I guess, gramming, I'm an old, through a museum exhibition of Elizabethan culture. Their commentary on it about gender in Elizabethan clothing, especially, was so incisive and funny, and I kept going back over and over to their posts. They took complicated concepts and broke them down into pieces that made me think. Really great scholarship points us to things that are there, but we are overlooking or taking for granted. Shows us how those things are more complex than we imagined, and then simplifies them for us to better understand. This is something that Sawyer Kemp does frequently and well. And some may not think of great scholarship as being something we find on social media, but for many of us, that is where we connect with other academics. And if you have had any of my upper level courses, you'll know how often I come into class saying, yo, one of my scholar friends said the best thing on the internet, and I have to tell you about it. That is where I have gotten to know Sawyer Kemp over several years, and where they make the invisible visible and the difficult accessible all the time. Because the issues Dr. Kemp works with are difficult, in part because they are deeply personal. Bodies, gender, identity, these are part of our lives all day, every day, and can be incredibly difficult to feel our way through. They are certainly difficult to parse in literary texts. Because of this, Dr. Kemp wrote in 2019's Transgender Shakespeare Performance, a Holistic Dramaturgy, in Journal of Early Modern Cultural Studies, we need more dynamic tools for investigating and representing the figure of trans as both a passing and non-passing entity, a person who may be either dysphoric or coherent, a body that may be content or at odds with itself, a body that may be an object of desire or ridicule. Dr. Kemp brings to scholarship those very tools and challenges us to build more tools, always bringing an intensely human reading to everything. Sawyer K. Kemp is an assistant professor of English at Queens College, CUNY. Their work has appeared in Shakespeare Quarterly, Shakespeare Studies, the Journal for Early Modern Cultural Studies, Shakespeare Bulletin, and the edited collection Teaching Social Justice Through Shakespeare. Their most recent article, Transliterature and Inclusion, is forthcoming in the Routledge Handbook of Transliterature. They are co-editing a collection of essays with Simone Chess for ACMRS Press entitled Early Modern Trans Drama, and co-editing with Nicholas R. Jones the early modern volume of Bloomsbury's A Cultural History of Trans Lives. Their monograph in progress is Transgender Shakespeare's and Accessibility Theater. They are here this evening to talk about early modern trans characters and their historical counterparts. So this time, instead of saying, I saw the best thing on Twitter or Instagram and you have to hear it, I get to bring you the real live person. So it is my great privilege to introduce to you Dr. Sawyer Kemp.
I'm genuinely touched. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm pretty sure that the post that galvanized this lecture is that I said Queen Elizabeth's her gender was taking things. Thank you so much again for that introduction, and thank all of you for inviting me to the University of Lynchburg to share some of my research. I also wanted to say a quick thank you to whoever made this incredibly beautiful poster of Mal Cuthbert looking so cool. And I also want to thank Alyssa for bringing me this water. So I don't think we realized this when we planned my visit, but we are actually only a few days out from the Transgender Day of Visibility, traditionally March 31st. So in the spirit of visibility, before we dive in, I wanted to take a moment to briefly indulge my hope that your interest in early modern trans studies might also indicate an investment in the health and well-being of trans people in our present moment. There are 533 anti-trans bills introduced to or under consideration by state and national legislature this year. It's March, by the way. 533. So far, 16 of these have passed. Actually, yesterday it was 15. I woke up to new legislation from Idaho, had to update my slides. So 16 have passed, 87 have failed, and 430 are still active. The Commonwealth of Virginia had 11 anti-trans bills under consideration this year, 4 bills that discriminate against trans women's participation in sports, 2 bills requiring educators to out students to their parents, 3 bills detailing healthcare and insurance exclusions, and 2 bills establishing a trans-exclusionary legal definition of sex for the entire Commonwealth. It was a relief to me to see that all 11 of these Virginia bills had either failed or been tabled in February, but if it seems like the amount of anti-trans legislation is skyrocketing, it is. The number of anti-trans bills considered across the US has broken records for 4 consecutive years. This chart and all of the data that I've showed here are from the Trans Legislation Tracker, which is a really great resource. So something that is weird about being a person who researches in trans studies, and I think also about being transgender in general right now, is that we're sort of forced to have 2 simultaneous conversations. The first of those conversations is very basic level defensive arguments about the right to exist. The right to take up space in public, to go to the bathroom, to be safe at school, to have access to life-sustaining healthcare, to not be killed passively or directly. Within the community, I have to tell you that we are having way more complex and nuanced and self-reflexive and intersectional conversations. Within trans communities and trans studies, we're talking very skeptically about the limits of visibility, of representation, and inclusion. These often are euphemisms that travel into the workplace or the academy in place of activist language like justice, community, or care. When trans people are merely included in an organization, for instance, without other members who have the education, training, or empathy to support them, inclusion serves the institution's optics while harming the actual individual being included. Thinking more structurally, critics like C. Riley Snorton and Jen Haridaworm have written about the way the discourse of trans rights has had an extractive and necropolitical relationship to Black trans death, using Black lives to promote gentrifying and nationalist projects. Dean Spade similarly argues that rights-based approaches to trans liberation and the pursuit of hate crime legislation in particular has allowed trans people's interests to be used to increase incarceration of people of color rather than actually reducing violence against transgender communities. Spade evinces a skeptical relationship to what he calls recognition and inclusion reforms, especially toward inclusion that benefits a carceral, capitalist, or military state, cautioning against the fight for inclusion in systems that the most important movements of our times are trying to dismantle. These critiques are representative of dialogue within and across trans circles, and scholars that are suspicious of the limits of assimilation to heteronormative and cisnormative socio-political status. And they are important conversations to have, but they're the ones that keep getting deferred because we can never move beyond that first level defensive basic argumentation about the validity of trans life when we are under constant political assault. This is also part of the stakes and limitations for a historically located field like early modern trans studies. On one hand, the fact that gender nonconformity and sex and gender variance beyond a kind of binary dimorphic system has a history as long as time itself is a validation for contemporary trans life. It gives the lie to transphobic claims that trans identity is new or faddish, untested, and dangerous to know that trans people have existed since long before we had the language of transgender. And also, early modern trans studies does more than simply diagnose the people of the past. In this period of the 16th and 17th centuries, where gender, race, and ability are being actively co-constructed to legitimize a European colonial project, thinking about sex and gender unveils the methods of hierarchical categorization of difference. Early modern trans studies is challenged to do the work both of archival recovery of evidence of trans life and to interrogate the nature of gender itself as a regulatory apparatus. We gotta do it all. In this talk, I wanna share some case studies from early modern history and literature to think with you about how the contemporary desire, and I would even say urgent political need, for a liberatory trans archive of the past sits alongside the knowledge that privilege is relational and situated. I want to resist overly valorizing gender nonconforming historical entities so that we can see their historical conditions and the historical conditions of sex and gender more clearly. To that end, I'm sharing 3 or maybe like 3.5 examples of moments at which there is an attempt at a brokering of sex and gender. The first is a literary treatment of the intersex street vendor Aniseed Water Robin. The second is a play about the Basque nun turned soldier Antonio de Arauso. And lastly, Shakespeare's most transgender play, Othello. You were thinking of Othello, right? These case studies complicate how gender can be ambivalently leveraged toward and inculcated by economic and colonial imperatives. My first example comes from a figure who appears in a number of early modern popular media and texts. And I have a slide about notes about language because I don't have time to be as precise and beautiful as I would like to be. So if you want to talk about this later, I'm happy to do that. Aniseed Water Robin was an apparently real historical person, a street vendor who sold the medicinal liquor aniseed water in the London markets and who seems by most accounts to have been intersex. Aniseed Water Robin is a fascinating figure for trans studies, not necessarily because of their intersex status, although that is the reason they became a local celebrity in the early 17th century. I first encountered Robin in The Life and Death of Miss Mary Frith, the alleged diary of Moll Cutpurse, where they appear as an object of scorn that Moll, the infamous cross-dressing pickpocket, despises and physically assaults. And I'm sad to say I am about to lightly slander our poster child for this event. So this is a quote from her alleged diary. There was also a fellow contemporary of mine as remarkable as myself called Aniseed Water Robin, who was clothed very near my antic mode, being an hermaphrodite, a person of both sexes. Him I could by no means endure, being the very derision of nature's impotency, whose redundancy in making him man and woman had in effect made him neither. And indeed, I think nature owed me a spite in sending that thing into the world to mate and match me, but contrariwise, it begot in me a natural abhorrence of him with so strange an antipathy that what by threats and my private instigating of the boys to fall upon and throw dirt at him, I made him quit my walk and habitation, that I might have no further scandal among my neighbors, who used to say, here comes Moll's husband. In the affective desire of queer archive, we might hope to find solidarity in these two people who seem like victims of the same repressive gender binary. But instead, we encounter a defensive reinscription of power in Moll's violent response to Robin. Even if we cannot assume that the narrative in The Life and Death should be attributed with authenticity to Moll directly, it nevertheless records a socially understood hierarchy. Maul's constructed performance of masculine gender and the assumption of a stable, true gender lying somewhere beneath her men's clothes is privileged over the natural changeling hermaphrodite whose physical body impossibly occupies both sexes at once, and therefore neither. The hermaphrodite is a character in the history of intersexuality, in the generation and maintenance of the cisgender subject, and, as this interaction with Maul suggests, in the history and circulation of intra-community negative affects, feelings like shame, disgust, and competition. The scholar Ruth Gilbert has a very thorough reading of Maul's ambivalence for nature versus artificial gender nonconformity, but I would add that Maul's revulsion is not only a response to Robin destabilizing her own position on the borders of gender differentiation, that's a quote from Gilbert, but rather that Maul's revulsion is reflective of an assumed superiority of masculine performance over the monstrosity of ambiguous transfemininity. Maul is clear about her abhorrence of that thing sent into the world to mate and match her. Robin for Maul is a dark mirror of Adam's Eve. The scene is ripe for presentist projections and ugly feelings. Maul's rejection of Robin is simultaneously the 17th century hic mulier throwing dirt at the hermaphrodite, but also 21st century Twitter's turf lesbian howling that no one can make them have sex with a trans woman. Of course, Robin is not a trans woman, but that doesn't mean Maul isn't a turf. It also doesn't mean that Maul doesn't have trans capacity, as Marjorie Rubright has argued. Rather than straightening or cisifying what we know of Maul Cutpurse, I rather suggest that this passage from the life extends the way we have learned to see Maul and the queer histories we anchor onto her. The passage above suggests that trans capacity also includes the icky and uncomfortable characters of the gender-critical border wars. The endangered cisgender butch, the feminized and infantilized transmasculine child, and even the transmisogynist transgender man. We must hold all of these rhetorical archetypes when we look to make meaning of the past. With Maul, we see a scene of one gender nonconforming historical character scrabbling atop the other for legitimacy that neither are likely to receive. This was my first introduction to Aniseed Water Robin, but once I started looking, I actually started to see Robin everywhere. Robin appears as the subject of several satirical elegiac poems. Robin is remembered as a subject of popular songs and country dances. Robin is a background character in the rogue pamphlets because allegedly a rogue named Mold Sack married Robin by accident, thinking they were a woman, and then we have a kind of classic transphobic reveal when he realizes it's a bit more complicated than that. So, and Robin gets name dropped in poems about the very first coffee houses. Robin appears in tall tales reported in dubious and sensational periodicals like the Laughing Mercury, and is recorded in almanacs between jest and earnest like the Merlinus Anonymous. The thickly populated Aniseed Water Robin multiverse presents Robin as a local micro-celebrity that readers are expected to already know, an insider reference for 17th century Londoners. Most, if not all, of the primary materials that mention Robin are what I would generously call unfriendly interlocutors, who are using Robin to make a joke about either sexual availability, unmasculine men, bodily difference, or sex variation. Unsurprising in light of the riveting work done by scholars like Leah Devon and Kathleen Perry Long on hermaphrodites and monstrosity, Robin appears in these texts associated with the criminal, the ridiculous, the hypersexual, the excessively reproductive, and the foreign. In The Laughing Mercury, for example, Robin appears in a tawdry anecdote that claims Robin met a crew of lusty ranters, a pantheistic religious sect, at a tavern in Southwark, who made a trial of him by paying both a female and male member of their order to engage in sex with Robin for the purpose of seeing which mate is best for a person for whom the opposite sex is neither. Some scholars have cited this as if it were an episode that actually happened, but I pulled the next issue of The Laughing Mercury and found it contains a sort of sequel episode in which the paper reports the ranters began to multiply so exceedingly since Robin hath been of their congregation, that they are so strong that every Sabbath they go a priest hunting. The Mercury specifically marvels in Robin's superabundant reproductive capacity, which has helped the ranchers multiply so exceedingly that Robin alone has made this fringe sect a threat to the established religious orders of England. Moreover, the other stories reported in these issues of Mercury are things like mermaid sightings and people of far-flung islands with fox heads. The curation of Robin alongside these tabloid-style travel narratives deliberately aligns the idea of sex variation and religious heresy under the veneer of their shared un-Britishness. But as I said before, I'm not bringing this person to trans studies as an example of gender fluidity because Robin was intersex. I want to talk about gender as a regulatory apparatus rather than a state of embodiment, and so think about whether that gender fluidity can be, absorbed. I want to think with you all about when and how a dominant culture moves to recuperate and sanitize outcast figures who trouble hierarchies and systems of categorization and difference. I want to talk about Aniseed Water Robin because Robin is forcibly, posthumously transitioned by Daniel Defoe in the 18th century for the good of England and to punish the Dutch. In 1726, Daniel Defoe writes A Brief Case of the Distillers and of the Distilling Trade in England, making an argument in favor of legalizing distillation in England, largely on the premise that the Dutch are making enormous profits by buying up English corn, barley, and malt, distilling it, and selling it back to the English as booze. He bolsters this economically prosperous proposal with a logical argument separating the vice of drunkenness from the product liquor, a connection he believes is being pushed by beer and winemakers whose only real desire is for minimal competition. And he also makes a xenophobic and nationalist case against the Dutch and the French, who he says are using English crops toward extractive and exploitative ends. Finally, Defoe puts the argument to the reader in what he calls a kind of historical way, tracing the petty distillers that worked from the time of James I to the Restoration. Early distilling, pre-Restoration, he says, was largely for physical uses. He describes the recipes used to produce these cordial waters and talks about their consumers and points of sale. Of all these cordial waters, according to Defoe, the most popular was aniseed water, which he calls the Geneva of its time. Then Defoe trots out an old friend. Aniseed water had this particular article attending it, that it was cried about the streets, of which the memory of the famous Aniseed Robin will be a never-dying testimony, who was so well known in Leadenhall and the Stocks Market for his liquor and his broad-brimmed hat, that it became proverbial when we saw a man's hat hanging about his ears to say, he looks like Aniseed Robin. Robin's sales pitch song has become a never-dying testimony to an industry of liquor that Defoe believes, for the good of the nation, the English must return to. He hails Robin not just as a vendor who is eponymously identified with aniseed water, but as an enduring memory of a kind of golden age of liquor. Defoe praises the mode of sale that Robin embodied, commending the frugality and efficiency of being able to buy a small dram of a more potent liquor, and the convenience of the portable distribution. That is to say, if Robin is wandering around the streets giving sips of aniseed water to those who hail for it, workers can simply do a quick shot and get back to work, barely interrupted. So, for the convenience of the delivery service, for the ingenuity of distillation, for the economic profit of a domestic product, and for the strength of something not entirely unlike branding, Defoe enthuses about aniseed water Robin. For Defoe, Aniseed Robin is a magnificent fellow in his day, I assure you. You will notice that for Defoe's purposes, Aniseed Robin is not a hermaphrodite at all. This Robin is completely sanitized of all feminine association. Defoe makes no mention of children or sexuality. Robin is not played for laughs. Instead, Robin is transformed into an emblem of a Georgic utopia of business that could have been and should be. The hermaphrodite is transformed under Defoe to be a gender-conforming icon of industry, one that could even protect us from the encroach of foreign economic peril. I'm offering this text as a way to think about the problems of trans studies, intersex studies, and the distance and precarity of archive. I want to propose we think about what it means for a subject to have been ascribed gender fluidity without agency. Transparently, I'm also thinking about our contemporary moment where we have simultaneously an increase in euphemistic and sometimes superficial types of inclusion and an increase in gender-based violence and discrimination. Defoe's recuperative transition of Robin demonstrates the mutual co-construction of race, gender, and class such that a man is definitionally a good white British subject. It also betrays the plasticity of these categories when a subject contains potential utility for nationalist goals. Aniseed Water Robin is granted a posthumous, non-consensual, normative gender status that was never made available to them during the course of their life. Defoe operationalizes Robin as a rhetorical tool for economic ends. It is a transaction that Robin has no control over. In my next example, I want to look at another transactional transition where the subject has more direct agency. For many years, Antonia de Arauso was hailed as one of Spain's first and most accomplished female writers. Over the last decade, and in the wake of queer theory and more recently trans studies, scholars have begun to reevaluate the role that a person who lived their life asserting their masculinity and demanding to be recognized as a man should have in the history of women's writing. At 15 years old, de Arauso fled a monastery life destined for nunhood and joined the Spanish army. In the ensuing years, he became a leader in the conquering force that invaded Venezuela, Peru, and Chile, carrying out devastating violence on behalf of the Spanish crown. Arauso was eventually outed and having been assigned female sex, arrested and investigated by the Inquisition, where he no doubt suffered humiliation and physical violence. However, after making a legal appeal, it was concluded that Arauso had lived and fought so well as a soldier of Spain against the indigenous people of Chile that he was granted a papal dispensation to live the remainder of his life under his male identity, Antonio de Arauso. The scandal and sensation of Arauso's life was dramatized in a very popular Golden Age Spanish comedy, La Moña Alferez, or The Lieutenant Nun. As I alluded to in my introduction, and in general, the field of early modern trans studies has often pushed back against the task of identifying or diagnosing trans historical figures, a process that can be affirming in terms of representation, but risks flattening historical nuance and the complexity of identity across time. And yet, Antonio de Arauso is in some ways one of the easiest inclusions I've ever encountered. This man could not be clearer in life or in the playtext where his story was enthusiastically consumed again and again. Guzman, the play's version of Arauso, says, "I am not a woman while I yield this blade that has defeated so many men." Guzman will fight for his life as a man and literally sets the stakes of his gender as a matter of life and death. He says he won't die being seen as a woman and fumes, "Why would I want to go on living if everyone knows I'm a woman? And I told you that death meant nothing to me compared to revealing that I was a woman." He is willing to kill, endanger, ruin, and threaten those closest to him to maintain male identity. Violence is in fact his most ready tool. When Don Diego outs Guzman to save him from being sentenced to execution, Guzman experiences the death of his cis identity and the beginning of a world of misgendering, slander, and stigma. For this, he seeks vengeance on his former best friend. "I had to punish you for all the insults, infamy, and bitter condemnation that I have suffered and still suffer for your inability to keep your word." In the play's denouement, Guzman reasserts his masculinity and the homosocial and homoerotic intimacy he shares with Don Diego by insisting on a duel. He says, "I'm not a woman if you want satisfaction." More than simply a phallic prop played for stage laughs, Guzman affirms his gender and enlists Don Diego in gender labor, co-creating male-male intimacy by routing their relationship through structures available between men, the duel. Other markers of social transition abound. Guzman gains his livelihood in a man's profession as a soldier and is validated by the romantic attentions and monetary favors of noble men and women who desire intimacy with this man, Guzman. Even after being outed, characters are kidding on the square with asides like, "Stubbornness is the only thing she shares with a woman." Even as they delight in the transphobic glee of transvestigation, they cannot reconcile the alleged primacy of biological gender with this fierce man who simply will not stop trying to kill them with swords. That is literally the play. In the play's third act, Guzman seeks legal recognition with documents asking the King of Spain that he allow me to live always as a man. This turn to the biopolitical bureaucracy of sex and gender is the play's most prescient and stunning twist. The arbiter of sex is an offstage deus ex machina intervention, a figure who can simply make the problem go away. Like the goddess Venus in John Lilly's play Galatea, the power to change sex was always available at the highest levels of authority. Unlike Galatea, where Venus promises to turn one of the two lovers into a boy just after the play's concluding scene, the fulfillment of the sex change is administrative in nature, and therefore we do get to see it happen on stage. At the end of the act, our Guzman stands before us legally a man, retroactively validating his assertions, if not perhaps his behaviors and actions throughout the play. And the evidence in the play is only one part of the case for a trans Arauso, since we also know from various sources that he sought legal and religious authorization to live and be recognized as a man. This is a lot of evidence for a person in history who we can safely call trans in the modern sense, even though that word was not available to him. But do we want to claim Erauso or his fictionalized iteration as Guzman for trans history? While Guzman and de Erauso's entry into the register of early modern trans history may be a project of trans and queer archiving, it is an affectively complex object of recovery. De Erauso's gender identity is uniquely straightforward and thus amenable to this backward gaze of diagnosis, by which I mean, as I said, he spent his entire life saying loudly and clearly that he was a man, he performed masculine-coded jobs, his masculinity was bolstered time and again by the gender labor of his social peers and mentors, and he negotiated a legal gender change recognized by his government. And yet, critical to his legal gender transition is his role in the project of militarized Spanish colonization, a phenomenon that would seem to invert the work in trans studies that has largely ascribed gender ambiguity and nonconformism to the position of oppressed subjects. Contemporary readers of The Lieutenant Nun are confronted with a puzzling personage in both the dramatic character of Guzman and the historical figure de Erauso. De Erauso/Guzman's masculinity is not a decolonial gender. It is specifically a colonial gender, one that could not be possible without having directly performed violence against the indigenous peoples of Chile and Argentina. In one of the first works in gender studies on de Erauso, Sherry Velasco suggests that he was rewarded for her gender transgression by Pope Urban IV and Pope Urban VIII and King Philip IV of Spain. But I would posit that he was rewarded with gender transgression. He was explicitly rewarded for colonial violence. If the X in Latinx is a wound, not a trend, as Alain Palaez Lopez's namesake article claims, Erauso is not the wounded victim of colonization, but among the many perpetrators wielding the sword. In The Coloniality of Gender, Maria Lugones theorizes that colonized genders are empty ones because sex was made to stand alone in the characterization of the colonized. Spanish colonizers used sexual dimorphism as a regulatory violence to eradicate non-Christian gender and sexual variance. Erauso is of particular interest to trans studies, and perhaps particularly suited to approach via Lugones, because of the function of the Spanish military occupation and religious missions was to enforce Christian sex and gender norms. Anticipating Lugones, Greta Gard's 1997 Toward a Queer Ecofeminism illustrates the moving goalposts of so-called nature and the natural as tools of colonialism. The construction of sodomitical acts and gender-variant social presentation as unnatural allowed invading forces to legitimize violence against indigenous people as part of a holy war. Erauso's subjectivity as colonizer, but also gender transgressor, would seem to be a self-destructive one. This context helps us understand why it is imperative for Erauso to be male, to be disidentified with femininity, and even from gender nonconformity. By aligning with the repressive state apparatus and enacting masculinity specifically through his role as a soldier, Erauso not only legitimates his transition to a male social role, but also distances himself from racialized categories of gender transgression. This brings us to Othello, which I hope to use as a coda to think about the limits of this kind of transactional transition, but also the potential for early modern and other historical modes of trans studies to help us think with complex tools about transliberation. It is tempting to move from The Lieutenant Nun to The Roaring Girl, the dramatization of our problematic fave Moll Cutpurse, because they offer us similarly comedic and swashbuckling transmasculine heroes. But a tragedy like Othello allows us to see how Othello perhaps imagines a long reparative arc like Erauso, one in which he is rewarded with access to normative state-sanctioned masculinity in return for his military service. I've previously written about Othello as a trans play in an interview with Skylar Cooper, a trans man who played the role of Othello twice, before and after transition. There and here, I not only claim that Othello can be an important play for trans studies, but also that its contributions to trans studies might be as much about the play's structures of anti-Blackness as about its depictions of any character's gender. In other words, Shakespeare is showing us how to think about trans as a hermeneutic through which to analyze structures of race. Cooper's performance of both butch female and male Othellos have prompted me to think seriously about the potential for a transmasculine reading that is both literally available in the sense of what if Othello was a trans man in performance, and also theoretically implicit in the sense that the play cannot stop reminding us that the character of Othello exists in a world where he is permanently precluded from accessing state-sanctioned forms of masculinity, much like our aniseed water Robin before Defoe gets to them. In this interpretation, Iago acts as a supra-social force bent on punishing Othello's exceptionalism and pride, and he succeeds by preying on Othello's interwoven queer shame and double consciousness. Iago affects this through repeated invocations of racist animal imagery to describe Othello, which he increasingly mirrors with the emasculating language of cuckoldry. This is introduced early in Act 1, Scene 1, when Iago taunts Brabantio that his daughter will be covered with a Barbary horse, threatening that the senator will have coursers for cousins and jennets for Germans, using cavalry horses to suggest that if Othello is a military icon, he represents the lower half of the man-horse pairing, a symbol that Shakespeare echoes by housing Othello and Desdemona's wedding night at the Sagittary, an inn named after the half-horse, half-archer Sagittarius. Iago's construction of Othello suggests that he may look like a man up top, but it would take, to use contemporary transmasculine terminology, an elaborate bottom surgery to make the centaur into a man. If Othello's race prevents him from accessing normative white-coded male gender, this reaches an important apex in Iago's series of speeches in Act 4, Scene 1. Here, Iago works Othello up by pretending to calm him down, leading in again with bestial imagery of being yoked like an ox. Iago packs the lines with digs that undermine Othello's gender. Bear your fortune like a man, good sir, be a man, a passion most unsuiting such a man, and I shall say you're all in all in spleen and nothing of a man. This 30-line spree is a dedicated effort to de-gender Othello. While critics often read this as a scene of one of emasculation and feminization, indeed often making little distinction between these two terms, the trans perspective embodied in this performance shows us that it matters that Othello is de-gendered rather than represented as a woman. With the added echoes of trans performances like Cooper's, these systemic attacks on Othello's masculinity and manhood are revealed more profoundly as an artificial moving target that he is set up never to meet. This reinterpretation of Othello's increasing isolation and paranoia is crucial because it has for centuries been the key to representing the play's racial politics. Is Othello a rational man or a violent animal? A trans-analytic shows how his suspicion is a rational response to the twin perils of the tenacity of oppression and the tenuousness of allyship. Othello's experience of constantly proving and reproving his right to his job, partner, and basic humanity echoes the way that Black transgender men and transmasculine people re-encounter gendered anti-Blackness as part of their transition. First-person accounts of Black trans men show that although their transitions brought them a greater sense of internal congruity, they also experienced different treatment in public and social spaces. In addition to describing more aggression from peers in public, many interviewees reported experiences of violence escalating if the hostile party discovered they were not cisgender men. In a controlled qualitative study interviewing Black trans men, researchers White et al. Found that all participants described consistent experiences of systemic oppression, either through overt acts of discrimination and harassment, microaggressions, or stereotypes placed upon them as Black men. The study findings identify this recurrent theme as the sense of what they call having a target on your back. Foregrounding a transmasculine reading of Othello allows us to see how the target on his back fuels Othello's mounting paranoia, which becomes an increasingly palpable force. This is not to say that the play represents Othello as a rational person and therefore is not a racist play, but a transanalytic helps us see the appeal of militarism to the always already embattled character of Othello. The transanalytic also helps us see, however, that this militarism cannot save him from racialized and gendered violence. If Othello's paranoia illustrates White et al.'s target, we might also read his military service as a reification of double consciousness. Othello accurately predicts that his military successes will, at least temporarily, excuse the interracial marriage. He says, "My services which I have done the signori shall outtongue his complaints." And indeed, the Duke smooths over Othello and Desdemona's elopement with the furious Brabantio, however superficially, because he has immediate need of Othello's tactical expertise. Like the Lieutenant Nun, Othello is a play about code switching and the limits of code switching. Othello's exceptional status as a military strategist, like Erauso, enables him access to privileges of station, but ultimately cannot protect him from the interpersonal and racist violence. In fact, the play opens with a discussion about how Othello's very presence in the military is upsetting everything and making it difficult to follow traditional hierarchies. Othello's selection of the strategist Cassio for promotion over Iago is the complaint that introduces the play, not his marriage to Desdemona, which is really only the convenient and well-applied racist channel for Iago's vengeful campaign. Iago, spluttering with enjammed rage through overstuffed syllables of Alexandrines and feminine endings, complains to Rodrigo, "Why, there's no remedy, 'tis the curse of service. Preferment goes by the letter and affection, and not by the old gradation, where each stood heir to the first." And the line doesn't end, he continues, "After the caesura," directly linking the veneration for the old gradation right to his driving objective of the play, and to Othello's status as a racial outsider. "Now, sir, be judge yourself whether I in any just term am a fine to love the more." The threat of an imagined dangerous new order is familiar ground for today's transgender veterans. Cooper's performances of Othello drew realism from his lived experience as a military veteran and were informed by military policies du jour, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in the earlier production in 2005, and the then ongoing transgender service ban in 2019. Indeed, 1 in 5 trans people are veterans, making them twice as likely as cisgender people to have a military history. Thinking through race and gender with Othello in the current American political moment, when the Biden administration has reversed the Trump-era ban on transgender military service, but potentially still a volatile subject, the limits of Othello's social mobility remind us that participation in the state ultimately cannot protect against structural forms of racism or transphobia. A trans analytic reveals that the promise of liberal acceptance is itself yet another form of racism, misogyny, and homophobia. As I think this trio of texts has shown, our archive of trans texts need not, and indeed should not and cannot look for single issue struggle, or assume that race works apart from gender in structures of power and normativity. Rather, early modern trans studies must be reflexive and responsive in interrogating how nationalist and racializing technologies work in tandem with modes of gatekeeping sex and gender to produce and then restrict intersectional categories of difference.